Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast about liberal arts and classical education. I'm your host, Clay Green, a postdoctoral fellow at the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. I'm joined today by Jonathan Edelmann. Jonathan is assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Florida. He received his BA in philosophy from UC Santa Barbara, an MA in science and religion from Oxford, and a DPhil from Oxford in religious studies and theology. John is an expert in Hindu thought and the Sanskrit theological and philosophical tradition. John is interested in making constructive connections between Hindu thought and the science of evolution, as well as other branches of Western thought. Including, I believe, connections between the scholastics and Hindu thought. Isn't that right, John?
That's what I'm working on now. I'm interested in two quote unquote scholastic thinkers, Thomas Aquinas and a 16th century thinker named Jiva Goswami, who I'm going to be arguing as a type of scholastic in his approach.
Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that at some point.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Today, I think listeners and myself would be really interested to hear your perspective on the relationship between India and Europe. I've heard you say, I think very interestingly, that India is a part of the West, and that's something that we'll want to bring out a little more fully. But first, I just want to thank you for being here. It's a real pleasure.
My pleasure. This is my pleasure indeed. Actually, looking forward to this.
So let's start with your background. How is it that you became interested in philosophy and religion? And specifically, how did you become interested in the thought of India?
Yeah, well, just before this, we were showing, we're talking about our interest in the transcendentalists. And I don't often talk about this. I've often thought I should write a kind of memoir for my I believe it was my junior year, maybe my senior year English teacher, Mr. Potts. And he great teacher, wonderful person, but he assigned Thoreau's Economy. We had to read chapter 1 of Walden. And at the time, I really didn't like it. I found him to be, a very, I just didn't like it. But something moved me to buy a copy. I think it was my senior year, the summer after my senior year, and I just started reading it again, and he really drew me in, and I fell in love with his style of writing and his ideas, and as I got deeper into it, I noticed he was talking about the Greeks, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, and then I started reading more of him, and he started making connections with Indian thought and his kind of own reflections on it. And then I thought, well, let me check out some books on India. And that's really how it started, was through Thoreau and his it was not only India, but he got me interested in the Greeks, Chinese philosophy, and the Bible and biblical texts. Is interesting ideas about that too. And then when I went to college, I was doing my bachelor's degree in philosophy. I went to Santa Barbara to study philosophy, but they had a great religious studies department. I didn't ultimately get a degree in religious studies at Santa Barbara, but I started taking classes. They taught Sanskrit, so I started taking like introduction to Sanskrit, and then we started reading Sanskrit texts as an undergraduate. And
I was curious about that because that's the moment where you get serious, right? Once you've learned Sanskrit, you're through a portal.
Yeah, and it was yeah, and I knew that too. I could see that, like, all right, this is a different level of study. They had these great teachers that would come in, these Sanskrit teachers, and visiting lectures, but they had a very robust Sanskrit program. I read a bunch of Hindu texts, Buddhist texts, um, and I got, and there was a whole bunch of graduate students studying these things too. So it was, there was a like a community of people and that I could read with, and we reflected on them, and it was really, that's when I really started to see like, okay, I could actually study this seriously, and there's a pathway to do this in academia. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so interested in the the process of coming to study a civilization that in many ways seems rather foreign to us. Um, I'm a kind of amateur student of Arabic. I've taken about a year of Arabic classes, and what attracted me is that well, I could have spent that time picking up German, which eventually I should probably do, but I was attracted to the possibility of unlocking traditions that were otherwise completely inaccessible to me, and a whole way of thinking that I didn't have access to. So I wanted not only to get Arabic literature, poetry, philosophy, culture, but also Persian literature, philosophy, and culture. The Persian element is extremely
Yeah.
attractive to me.
Yeah, I liked that too. It was so unique and different. And now you're asking me, I also think that was really when I started to take comparative work very seriously. I did like a undergraduate thesis on Kant. I was writing about Kant, and then I was also reading this great Hindu thinker named Shankara at the same time. So I'd go to one class, like a Kant seminar, and then I'd go and read Shankara. And it was, I think what I liked about it also was the contrast. I felt immediately that studying this great quote unquote Hindu philosopher alongside the great Western, European philosophers that I was studying, it kind of it put them in a sharper relief. Like it was like I could see, it gave me a different perspective on Kant. It kind of gave me a really it created difference. I don't always like that word, but it did. It actually it threw him into a different light, and I got to thinking about him and his work, and a kind of gives you like a bigger perspective because you're dealing with something else that's very different. Um, it throws something that's familiar into a different perspective. Yeah, kind of like when you travel. I think that was when I started to think about doing comparative work as a kind of travel. When you go to a foreign country, one of the things that I found I often do is you compare. It's like, oh, they don't eat the way we eat. They don't greet each other the way we greet one another. They have all different range of customs, and it forces a kind of self-reflection. Like, well, why do we eat that way, and why do we greet each other this way? And so I think that was also what I liked. It was not only that I was studying something so different and ancient and unique and special, but it also kind of threw my own concepts and it into disarray, and really it forced me to kind of think about them in a different way.
When Peter Berkowitz came to Hamilton last spring, he had us all read this John Stuart Mill lecture, his inaugural lecture at St. Andrews. And if you haven't looked at that, I would highly recommend it, because one of the things he talks about is he justifies why we should study the classical civilization, specifically Greece and Rome. And he says that it's because through seeing this civilization that's totally different from ours, he's thinking of, the Christian civilization of 19th century Europe, we really come to understand our own. He doesn't use this exact phrase, but it's something like the cliche of the person who only knows one country knows no country, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
But he makes
yeah,
the point that we need that the classical civilizations are good for this because they're not so different that we can't quite establish a point of comparison. And I wonder if something like that might be true for India as well. So maybe here's a good moment to just put the question about India sort of bluntly. Is India Western? Um, and how would you schematize the Western and the non-Western?
yeah, yeah. It's a great question, and um, yes and no. It is Western, and it's also not Western. It's, geographically, it's not in the West, right? I mean, it's on the eastern side of the map, but of course, those are
So is Australia, right?
right. So is Australia. It's a bit arbitrary, but yes, I would make a very strong case that India, especially North India, South India is a little bit different, and here's why. But especially North India, all of the North Indian languages, the ancient language of Sanskrit. They had other languages we broadly call Prakrit, kind of vernacular languages, but all of the modern languages, Hindi, which is the biggest language in India, most popular language in India, Bengali, Gujarati, all of the North Indian languages they're European, they're connected with European languages. They're derivatives and related to Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is a cognate language with Latin and Greek. You don't have to study Sanskrit too long to see that really important words, the numbers, for example, family names, for example, words like knowledge, um, measurement terms, farming terms, kind of really important words. They're cognates. You immediately see like, oh, that's just a different form of a Greek or Latin word, or even English. You can recognize English and German words in Sanskrit. So that has led me into linguistic studies of history and culture of India. And it's more or less a foregone conclusion at this point. I don't think anybody really doubts it at this point that there is this thing we would call Indo-European language. And
EIE, is that the abbreviation?
yeah, I think sometimes
I. I
yeah,
think I've seen that somewhere.
IE, yeah, is the there's a lot of different ways that people flesh out how it happened, when it happened, how big it was. But I think most people would agree that the Sanskritic linguistic cultures of mainly of North India, Persian, Russian, German, all the way up to the ancient Celtic languages of Ireland, all the way down to the Sicily and the Italian languages and Latin, Spanish, French. They're all part of this larger language family that people call Indo-European, which is different from Chinese and Hebrew. And it's also different from the South Indian languages called Tamil and Telugu, although a kind of deep integration between the North and South of India took place a long time ago and continues to go on. So in that sense, I think it is Western. If we consider, Greece and Greek and Latin and German and English, these languages kind of definitively Western languages. And if it's also true that Sanskrit is cognate language, and with it comes all of the cognate concepts, different names for the gods and the pantheon of gods, and deep connections about the nature of ritual and religious notions of religious sacrifice and things like that, if all of the other things that come with the language are also cognate, there's a real sense in which we can say, yeah, India is part of the West. It has been for a very long time.
Can I ask you to just expound a little bit on that last point about the religious cognates, ritual, sacrifice, things like that? I'm interested by that,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
don't fully understand.
So the oldest layer of text that we have from India are the Veda Samhitas. And these are the Rig Veda is the most well-known, well studied, and it's centered around the idea of the fire, Agni, probably where we get our word ignite.
Hmm.
And the fire was the center of ritual. It was they would offer things into the fire, uh, food to the gods, and it would burn and go up to the gods, um, and that's related to Zoroastrians, this ancient, what's now part of Iran and the Caucasus areas, Caucasus Mountain areas. That was also a fire religion of the fire. And a lot of the similar words are used for fire rituals and things related to it. So, I don't know too much about the role of fire in Greece and those
You've got
areas.
the myth of Prometheus, right? Bringing fire to man.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Obviously they burned animal carcasses and once upon a time a daughter or two.
Right.
Uh,
Yep.
so yeah, those things are common. Are the burial
Yep.
practices common? The ancient um, uh, Mycenaeans did those big beehive tombs for the kings, obviously, but then the Homeric burial practices and all of the Greece, all the history of Greece that we're aware of in the ancient world is burning. Is that common
Yeah, they burn their bodies, it seems, of the dead.
in the Vedas as
Yeah.
well? Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a theory of culture or civilization. Maybe those aren't the words you would use. I'm interested in what words you would use that has to do with kind of deep practices of language, ritual. It reminds me a little bit of structuralism, if you're, familiar with that scheme of thought. I'm sure you are. Sorry.
Yeah. No, no.
That the category, our initial categories of things are maybe the most fundamental and shape everything, as opposed to, I'll just throw out my kind of common sense. One of my ideas of what makes Western civilization a distinct thing. I'm constantly refining these in conversations with people like yourself who've thought deeply about these matters. One of the things that's important to me is the idea of a historical consciousness, and what I mean by that is, John Locke talks about what constitutes personal identity. I love John Locke, by the way. That's a side thing, but what constitutes personal identity is possessing the same memories over time. There are problems with this that get pointed out, but Western civilization, going back to ancient Greece and to ancient Israel, really does have a continuous historical consciousness. That is, an understanding of what happened in the past that's basically never broken, going back from those two sources to the present. They have this idea of, even if at every single point we didn't identify with everyone who came before, there was a history that was uninterrupted and had kind of almost first person uh, perspectives. You know, we have Herodotus, we have Thucydides, we have Polybius, all these sorts of things. We have the historical writers in the Jewish Bible, and so I think of that kind of continuous sense of this is what happened in the past as part of what constitutes um, Westernness. And when there's a lack of awareness of something, when it's not included in the historical memory, um, you know, for most of Western history, there wasn't a strong understanding of what was going on in China, and there really wasn't a strong understanding of what was going on in India either. That seems to me to be a delimiter, but that's just one view, and maybe, you know, as you've had a chance to hear my perspective on this, maybe you can get some inspiration to elaborate your own thoughts about
Yeah.
what constitutes this.
Yeah, no, I agree that a kind of a historical consciousness, a sense of continuity is one of the defining features of what makes a culture is that people, they link themselves back to generally some kind of source text. That's been the Veda in India, the Veda and the Upanishads and all the texts that follow from it. But I think India, although it shares these deep linguistic and conceptual similarities with the West, it is nevertheless like tucked away. It's underneath the Himalayas, and so it was hard to reach. But there were these moments when people did go back there, and I think that they did feel like they were rediscovering something familiar. I mean, Alexander the Great, for example, is a time period. There were Greek people that came over before and after him who felt like they were discovering something similar. I think that also people like Roberto de Nobili in the 16th century, a missionary a Jesuit missionary went to India and came back feeling like there was something familiar there. But all of that aside, I think that India has not too many people. Let me put it this way. I think we're in a new, because of all the information that we have, the access that we have to text, since for the past few hundred years, we're at a new phase where I think we are rediscovering something that was forgotten. I do think that there's a sense in which, although India and Europe, I've said, I think have these similarities, they nevertheless separated and went along somewhat different tracks, and they still are on somewhat different tracks. And therefore, the cultural memory of India doesn't really include Greece or Europe in any significant sense, in the same way that, when we think of the great texts and ideas that define the West, it doesn't immediately bring to mind India. And there was at some point a separation, and difference was established, and they kind of went along their separate ways. And well, that's what I like about the books that I've been reading, that it has this sense of rediscovering something that was lost in time, and it's important to rediscover.
What books have you been reading? Are these new? Is this new scholarship or things
Uh,
from
but
earlier?
uh, fairly recent. Fellow named William Halbfass.
Hmm.
He wrote a book
Is he
called
India and Europe?
India and Europe. Yeah, an
Yeah,
essay on understanding,
yeah.
written in the late 1980s. Um, his argument is that there is this similarity between the two, and that India has more or less, his argument was that India has more or less been fairly self-satisfied with what it and has not really looked outside of itself uh, to develop and further its understanding of itself. And that seems pretty right to me.
Hmm.
Nobody really, intellectuals didn't really leave India until the late 1900s.
Hmm.
They were more or less happy with what they had there, and they didn't, aside from I shouldn't say that, the Buddha, more
Hmm.
Hindu thinkers didn't leave. The Buddhists left early and went up into China, and they preached and spread Indian ideas.
Can
They
I
spread.
can I just say that India has always struck me as an absolutely magnificent civilization, and especially the
Yeah,
Hindu tradition.
yeah,
So I can see why like Japan or these different countries, I can see why India would I can see why people would feel that way because it's
yeah,
such a deep history and so many amazing figures and such a you know you know infinitely more about this than I ever will, but I am just full of admiration for India and always have been.
yeah. It was extremely literate, still is, rich in its own diversity. There's actually so many different vernacular languages and
It's an enormous landmass too, right? So
play.
it's
Yeah,
not hard to imagine it as the world, you know?
right. And it's really, it is kind of isolated in the sense that you've got the Himalayas
Mhm.
to the north, and it's a peninsula. So if you're going to get into India, you have to cross the Himalayas, or go by boat. So those were the limitations there. I'm also reading this guy, M.L. West. He wrote a book called Indo-European Poetry and Myth, and
Mm.
he makes a very strong case, and he shows not only philological similarities but conceptual similarities between a whole range of Indian and European texts, and that's also fairly recent, like the 1990s.
Mm.
Sir William Jones, who was one of the first British,
Even I know who he is.
yeah, he went to India. He wrote a paper in the late 1700s. Oh my, it was kind of an aha moment for
Yeah.
him. He really started this conversation. He was like, "Oh my God."
If he was around today, he could have gotten tenure just off that.
One would hope.
One would hope. Yeah. Maybe if he was around in the 1950s or something.
Yeah, one never knows. Yeah. So that's when I think he really initiated the discussion.
He made the points about Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, right?
Yep.
Yeah, which, once you see them are, they're
Right.
mind blowing.
And
Yeah.
then that started a process of teaching Sanskrit
Mhm.
in universities, mainly in classics departments. So you had a number of noteworthy classicists who were teaching Latin and Greek, who took on Sanskrit, and they started teaching it in classics departments, and it became, and it still is, some classic departments still do teach Sanskrit, and the idea being is, well, it's another classical language, part of the same culture and civilization.
Is Sanskrit a hard language to teach or learn?
Um, yes and no. It takes a long time. I think, especially, I unfortunately didn't grow up learning Latin and Greek, but I think if you if you did learn Latin and Greek, then I think it's not as hard. The students that I've had who came out of a classical education picked it up really quickly and
Mm.
easily, because they had all the structures, like how to decline a word and how to conjugate a verb, and they saw all the cognate words very easily and very quickly. But when I took it, I had studied Spanish and a little German. So it was studying Sanskrit for me was also learning about English grammar, all these obscure grammatical terms that you had to learn and learn, kind of restructure your mind to think about a language in a different way. So that's a big challenge. Once you get it, it's an elegant, beautiful language. I love it. I mean, I love teaching it. Um, I love reading it. Once you get it, I find it to be just inherently pleasurable just to read it, whatever you're reading, because it is such a well crafted language. It's a language that it's an artificial
Yeah,
language,
I
and
was going to ask, is it a literary language?
it is. Yeah, I mean, but it's a made language.
Mhm.
Like it's got a very elaborate
Yeah.
grammar, especially if you study the grammatic text. And Indians have thought about grammar very, very deeply for thousands of years. It's Fritz Stahl, who was an Indologist, a scholar of India at UC Berkeley for many years. He wrote a great paper where he argued that as the Greeks focused on mathematics, the Indians focused
Mm,
on grammar.
mm,
And
mm.
these were the kind of defining sciences of the two. So that's maybe a big difference between the two civilizations. But the result is that Sanskrit is this very well thought out language, and it's um, you feel like you're reading a scientific language, a crafted
Mm.
language that people really thought about and cared about. Yeah.
Is
So
there what are the genres that are that we have surviving Sanskrit of? I mean, I guess it's not just surviving because people have known Sanskrit continually, but maybe from something that you might call a classical period. What do we have? Do we have poetry, fiction, philosophy? Uh, what do we
the whole
have?
gamut. Yeah, I mean the whole gamut. As I said, the most ancient layer is a group of books called the Vedas,
Yeah.
which are called samhitas, which are kind of like collections, something that's put together. Seems like it was collected over a long period of time. They deal with ritual, cosmology, what's the structure of the universe, what is the nature of the fire. They talk a lot about something called soma.
Mm.
In Persia, it was called homa, and it's some kind of drink that they would consume ritually. It
Mm.
seems to have been some kind of psychedelic drink. People still wonder quite a bit about what it could have been. People think it might have been a psilocybin
Oh.
product, some relationship with ayahuasca, maybe ephedra. Maybe it was a mixture, a kind of cocktail of a number of different psychedelics. But soma is a huge topic. It was said to have brought enlightenment, visions of truth. Veda talks about the creation of the world, the creation of the sacrifice, um, different types of people, different categories of people, um, whole range of things. And then after that was a group of books called the Upanishads. The Upanishads are broadly analogous, I think, to Plato and Aristotle. Um, Quite different, but similar in some ways. And the Upanishads were more of a philosophical reflection on the Vedas. It was people stepped back from the Vedas. The Upanishads were probably started to be composed about 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And the Vedas were old at that point. And so the people who wrote the Upanishads or spoke them, starting to think about, what is a sacrifice? What is the nature of truth?
Mm.
What's the one thing that underlies the different gods? Also, the Vedas talk extensively about different gods and goddesses, all of which have some cognate um, with European gods and goddesses. So the Upanishads were kind of a beginning of a broader reflection on what is the nature of truth. At that time, the Buddha and Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, come up and start writing, and they're also kind of critically reflecting on things. So you get that early period also, these philosophical texts. Sometime after that, there's more systematic philosophical treatises about nature of yoga, the mind, consciousness. There's the beginnings of epistemology, what is the nature of truth, kind of a systematic investigation into truth claims and what justifies things. There's a whole genre of literature about debate. It seems like about 2,000 years ago, kings would invite different scholars of different traditions into the court, and they would have debates. So people started thinking about structures of debate, how to build an argument, what's a good argument, what's a bad argument. Lots of texts kind of trying to define what are the basic categories of existence. What are the things that are, and what are the things that are not. That's all going on a couple thousand years ago. Later on, 2,500 years ago, you get reflections on law, politics. Where does law come from? What makes something a law? What are the different rules that should govern society? What are the punishments for infractions of the laws? You get proto kind of scientific treatises about mathematics. Indians were also very, very skilled at mathematics. As I mentioned, there's a whole range of grammatical texts. What's a sentence? What is a word? What's the relationship between a noun and a verb? How do we make words? Where do words come from? A whole reflection on all aspects of language, music, drama. What makes a drama a drama? How is it? What are the different components of it? The kings were also hosting, dramatical events, and people started to reflect on, how do we analyze and criticize dramas? So that also meant that people were composing dramas. There were stories being told, and they were put in dramatic forms. A lot of them came out of what we call the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is a massive text, probably started around 2,500 years ago. Huge book, full of stories. The Ramayana maybe comes a little bit later, but stories about kings and queens and gods and the interactions between the gods and humans. And the Mahabharata especially gets into all kinds of issues about royal culture and what legitimizes, how does a king create legitimacy, disputes between kings, land grabs and espionage, and all kinds of fascinating stories.
Can I ask you a couple questions about the Ramayana and the
Yeah,
Mahabharata?
yeah,
So one of the things that Aristotle points out in the Poetics about Homer's epics is that, and why they become kind of a model, is that they are about one action. And that really is pretty impressive about the Homeric epics, when so many epics are part of this tapestry that tell many, many, many stories. And maybe the Homeric epics were originally something like that, but in the form that they became pseudo-canonized, because they were sort of like, a kind of Bible, or like you're describing some of these Hindu texts for the ancient Greeks. They came to have this very peculiar structure where there are a lot of little events, little narratives or episodes but really all of it kind of interestingly comes about because of one thing.
Yeah.
And when that is over, the story's over. Um, so the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are they put together, how are they put together? Let me just put it
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, they both do kind of focus on singular events. The Ramayana is the story of Ram, the god and king Rama, and his battle against Ravana, the kind of who is said to have lived in Sri Lanka. So it's more popular in the South. And it's about his kingship. It's about him as the most virtuous and righteous of kings, his relationship with his wife, Queen Sita, all of his trials and tribulations, banishment into the forest. So one of the themes you get there is his relationship with his brother and his father, but it's essentially the story of Rama, and he becomes a symbol or an image of the ideal king. The Mahabharata is essentially a story about the five brothers known the Pandavas, who are all kind of god humans. Their mother is a human, but the mother it has this ability to call a god at will. And so every god that she calls, she has a child with, and each of these children are children of the gods. They have a human mother, but God fathers.
Mm.
And it's a similar story of a conflict between good and evil, although the Mahabharata is a little more murky than the Ramayana about who's good and who's bad.
Mm.
But in the case of the Pandavas, these five brothers, they're the rightful heirs to a throne in North India, kind of modern day New Delhi. And it's their struggle to get their throne back, to become the kings, the royal family of North India. And it spirals off into all these other stories because they're children of the gods. You learn the stories of the gods, and there's so many sub stories and interrelated histories, and that's why the Mahabharata is so expansive, is that every kind of mainline story is connected with many other sub stories, but it is all nevertheless coming back to these five Pandavas, and it is essentially over once they have restored their rule and they've died, and other texts then pick up on their children and the things that happened after them. But that comes in a later genre of text called the Puranas.
Let me ask you a general question. When you're approaching these texts, you're obviously a scholar of Indian thought, literature, philosophy. How is there a way to relate to them in an existential sense that's authentic? What do I mean by that exactly? Well, that's kind of the question. I was interviewed by one of my students about a Barnes and Noble is opening in town, and so he interviewed me. What do I think about that? And he asked me what I was reading, and I told him I was reading David Bentley Hart's translation of the New Testament. And I sort of saw his face sink because he asked specifically, not for work. What are you reading? Right? Not for work. And I think in his mind, it's, not scholarly, right? And, I'm reading David Bentley Hart's translation of the New Testament because I want to see the different things, the different ways that he translates things in an attempt to be more authentic to the original. And even putting aside for a moment the spiritual aspect of it, maybe not totally putting it aside, but I just want to know what this ancient writer meant. I really do. And it isn't just scholarly. It's also it's a profound experience for me to begin to see into the mind and lives of someone who is, has this profoundly different experience and is in the deep past. And I want this connection with them. That's more than intellectual. um, I don't know if you relate to this at all, but is there a way, when you read this material, is there a way that you relate to it in a more than scholarly sense or a less than scholarly sense? Either way.
I think it's been a little bit of both. I mean, I'm kind of middle-aged now. I'd like to think of myself as middle-aged and not old, but
I certainly don't
um,
think of you as old.
um, I went to India as a young man. When I was about 18, 19, I bought a ticket for Calcutta and I took a train all the way from Calcutta to Delhi to Bombay, and I stopped all along the way. And um, you know, it didn't take me long, let me put it this way, to figure out India is a whole different ball game. It's, to use a good, a proper, Western analogy. But found myself searching for India, and then when I started reading Helpfast, and he was saying, I'd mentioned Helpfast, and I only mentioned half of his argument. The other half of his argument is that unlike Indians, Europeans have always been looking outside of themselves to discover something about themselves through their interaction with the other. That we have all, his argument is that we've always looked to, in his case, India. I think you could make a similar claim about China and Africa and other places, but his claim about India is that we as Europeans, I'm speaking here, we've looked at India as a way to kind of define who we are. And I don't know if I was conscious of that's what I was doing when I went to India when I was 19. But on the one hand, when I went as a young man, I saw this is a totally different place. It's organized in a different way. People think about almost everything in a different way. The religions are different. Even Christianity looks so different in India. If you go to a Catholic church or a Protestant church, that it's nothing like a Western church. They've appropriated Christianity, which has been there for a very long time. They've appropriated Christianity in a different way. So I immediately saw the difference, but at the same time, when I have read a book like the Bhagavad Gita, for example, which is part of the Mahabharata, I see
I read that, by the way.
Oh, good.
That's the one that I can say I read. It probably a terrible translation, but I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Yeah, and there's something that immediately resonates. There were so many things that spoke to me, and there is to this day so many things about as I said, I'm writing a book about Jiva and Aquinas. And Jiva talks about kind of a Trinitarian theology. He's got kind of a Trinitarian theology, and he's struggling with this issue of how can the one God be three separate parts that are each kind of unique in their own right, but also it's not a polytheism. How can there be these different aspects to the one God? It seems to me very resonant with Aquinas's struggle to do the same thing with the Trinity and notions of mystery. How does our talk about God and language transcend human reasoning, but also at the same time we can still reason about it? I see Jiva struggling with the same issue, and so there's so many things that do resonate, and the stories as well. It's a fascinating, the Mahabharata I was talking about, even though it is very old and ancient and exotic, and it's but at the same time, is it really that different than Homer? I mean, Homer's also
Homer's pretty weird.
it's pretty
When you
weird.
when
It's
you get
pretty
into it, it's
exotic,
pretty
right?
weird.
It's also exotic, right? I mean,
Yes, it
it's
is.
something.
Very much so.
There's something very new. When
Yes.
I first read Homer, I read the Odyssey. It's like there was that same sense of discovering something that is in some way part of our civilization, named cars after the book. Everybody knows the name Homer.
Can I give a small example of that?
Yeah.
So this isn't actually from Homer, it's from the Aeneid. There's a moment in the Aeneid, which is very Homeric, where um, Aeneas has just landed. He's in Libya, and he goes out and he's hunting, um, and he runs into his mother, uh, who is of course Aphrodite or Venus, and she's dressed as a nymph, uh, or like a huntress, right? Like an Artemis kind of figure, virgin huntress. And Aeneas says, you are so amazing, you must be a goddess. And she runs away. And as she's running away, she reveals that it's her. And when I read this, I thought, what was the point of her being dressed like a huntress? Right? Like, why did that detail need to be in there? And as I reflected on it, I started to think that, well, it's because in the religious imagination of the ancients, wholly disguised goddesses out in the world, in the forests, are part of what enchants the world, in the same way that the medievals had fairies and things like this kind of populating the world. And suddenly you're taken aback and you start to think, well, how would I see this world that I live in differently if I thought there were, virgin huntresses moving through the woods who were really goddesses? What I realized basically was that this was a genuine moment of theophany for the ancients. It wasn't just a little literary trope. Maybe it had become that, but Virgil was trying to enliven it again and make it, as I said, a genuine moment of, whoa, this is the power of God, or in this case of Venus. So I think I just offer that as an example of somewhere where I had to grow a little bit into the exotic imagination of this ancient writer.
I've had similar experiences reading Indian thought, that you see something that seems very different, but underlying it, you find something very familiar.
Hmm.
And that's a very powerful experience, because it begins to point to kind of universals. I think that when you look at these kind of ideas, maybe it's a literary trope or a philosophical idea or something like that, that when you read something like the Bhagavad Gita and you see something very different but also very familiar, it is that maybe that's similar to this kind of theophany that you're talking about. Is that kind of where do you think you can have that similar experience reading a text that, okay, this text, it seems like, is disguised in something very foreign or different, but then you encounter it, become familiar with it, and see that it's not something foreign, it's something that's just a disguise. And I do wonder if the the cultural or there's a surface level. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here, but I
Yeah.
do wonder if, like, the surface level differences that we encounter when we read something from a foreign culture or an ancient time, if through familiarity, becoming familiar with them, we do uncover something similar to what we've something more fundamental to the human psyche.
That's the great hope of maybe the old comparatists,
Yeah,
right? And that's out of fashion, isn't it?
I think that would be fair to say. Yes.
Why do you
I mean,
think that is?
um, I think that there's a number of reasons. The first reason that I've generally encountered, because I am in some sense trying to revive this type of comparative approach and this understanding of it. But the first thing, one of the things that I frequently encounter as a kind of skepticism about what I'm doing and the skepticism of people that were doing this is well, there's two things. There's a political opposition and maybe a more fundamental philosophical worry. Let me deal with the political
Hmm.
first. I think that some people feel like the the like late 19th century and 20th century comparativists, and there are people alive. I'm not alone. It's not like I'm alone in doing this. In fact, I could name drop if you want. There's quite a few very important people who are continuing this kind of work.
We'll get you all on the podcast, and
Yeah.
it'll be like a reunion.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, we need to unite here. But the political opposition, I think, is that the reason that these people did this comparative approach was as a kind of sly uh, approach to imposing Western and European values onto non-European texts, that it was part of a larger colonialistic
Yeah.
project to insert European thought into non-European colonized places. I don't think that was certainly there were people that did that. There's no doubt. I mean, that did happen. People did do those things. I don't think that was a universal truth. I don't think you can read everybody that way.
Hmm.
And I think if you do read some of the great late 19th century and early 20th century comparativists, you don't see that. You find a genuine and deep abiding love and appreciation for the things that they were encountering. And they were really seeking the truth of those texts for the inherent value of those texts and not for some political or social agenda. I don't think everybody is motivated politically in that way. Some people are, but not everybody.
Maybe the argument would be that the situation being colonial makes any other approach impossible. Maybe the argument would have some kind of uh, sense of material, a historical materialism, maybe.
Yeah,
Um, I'm not, I more or less reject historical materialism, as
right.
I've said on this podcast, but I think that might be the drift of it. They can't do otherwise, and their intentions maybe don't matter.
Yeah, well then to that I would say, okay, fine. Then that what was true for them would also be true for us.
Hmm.
And what kind of political regimes are we complicit in doing the work that we do? And that's a discussion. So if you want to have that discussion, that I think would be interesting.
Hmm.
Um, I think then you see it's a bit more complicated. And do you really want to, and I would put it to people that make that argument, do you really want to reduce everything that you do
Hmm.
to being complicit with some kind of American or European political agenda? That
Hmm.
if the people of the 19th century were incapable of separating themselves from their own political and social context, what makes you think that you're capable of doing that?
Hmm.
Because you do find that people in the past were uncoupled. They did try to uncouple themselves from their political and social agenda. They did resist um, whatever was going on around them, and they did critically evaluate their political and social context.
Hmm.
So they were conscious, I think, some of them at least. I can name some names if you want, but if we are as human beings incapable of separating ourselves from our politics, political regime in which we exist, then let's take that on board and think about self-reflect. Let's use that opportunity to locate ourselves in a particular context and make our own subjectivity an object of study.
That's a
Make
great point. And
yeah,
I
make
would want to get another figure into the mix talking about the way that we're all formed by political regimes, who would be Aristotle, who has his own sense of how that works that's different from the Marxian or even Marxist
right.
approach.
Exactly. It opens up a conversation about, well, how do we do that? What kind of structure do we use to even do that? If this is how this kind of political reductionism becomes problematic, because if we are by definition complicit within our own contemporaneous political regime, well, then how do we get out of it? What tools do we use to get out of it? We can't use the tools that we have because they would be part of the system itself. Do we use Aristotle? Do we use Foucault? Do we use the Bhagavad Gita? Do we use the Tao Te Ching? It opens that whole discussion. I think that we'd need to have that.
It feels like we're getting toward the second objection, but maybe the
Yeah.
second objection is a little different. What's the
No,
philosophical objection?
the philosophical objection, or maybe it's not, let's call it an intellectual objection, I think, an intellectual objection that when you try to, some people might argue that when you're dealing with big idea in India, an Indian text or a European text, that's basically what you can do. You've got 40, 50, 60 years of prime intellectual activity. It's going to take you that long to really master it, to then separate yourself from it, bring in a totally different system of thought that requires its own mastery and expertise that could take a lifetime. You're really running a big risk, someone might say. And that risk is that you use the concepts of one and you impose them on the other. You don't take enough time to adequately understand one or the other or both, that your comparisons are faulty comparisons because you can't really do that kind of, or it's too big of a project for one person to tackle. And the result, one could argue, is that you end up making a mess of both. You don't understand either one properly, and you end up failing on both accounts. And maybe you could call it a meta narrative problem. Some people might say with that, in order to do that kind of comparative work, you end up having to construct some kind of meta narrative. But in order to really construct a story about how intellectual traditions are constructed and develop, you need a lot of details.
Right.
And for every claim you make about a meta narrative or some kind of comparative node that you construct, you need a lot of details in order to do it. And that's just not feasible.
Yeah, that's a tremendous challenge that I think has to do mostly with, and here I'm going to sound a little bit like a materialist, but the structure of our university systems, the way that individual careers end up having to be structured, because in a way, our being incomplete shouldn't be a massive problem. We're making an attempt and we're grafting our own work onto the tissue of what's already existed. Obviously, it was a tremendous challenge to make the kind of scientific discoveries that have been made, and wasn't the result of a single person by any means. But in one's own career, sometimes the easiest or the safest thing to do is not to step out of line and do something that will subject you to a whole lot of criticism.
Yeah,
Some criticisms that I think are the easiest criticisms to make. This kind of, you're overgeneralizing, you're reducing it, and they're almost always right, of course, but
yeah,
when you're reaching for the highest shelf, it's I'm not going to land this metaphor well. You know, big big aspirations mean that you are inevitably going to fall short.
yeah, and that's what you fleshed out there about the kind of way universities are structured. That's one way of thinking about a university. There's other ways. When I was studying in England, there was the Bowdoin Professor of Sanskrit. This is the preeminent professorship for Sanskrit
Yeah.
in Oxford University. And the new fellow was hired, Christopher Minkowski. He's since retired, but when he gave his inaugural lecture, he started off by saying, at my job interview, the hardest question I got, and really the only question I got, was, you're sitting down for dinner, you're a scholar of Sanskrit, and you sit down from dinner and you're surrounded by the other faculty in the college. One's a scholar of, electromagnetism. Another is a scholar of T.S. Eliot. Somebody else does whatever. What do you say to them? How do you explain what you do to them? How do you make those connections? And because that's what we want. We want to have a community of people that do know a lot about one thing, but are also able to communicate that one thing to other people who are also immersed in one thing. And he gave his whole inaugural lecture kind of struggling with that simple question. How do you explain what you do to somebody who does something very different? So that for me is its own kind of expertise. That's its own quality that one might cultivate, this ability to dive into one thing. And I've always tried to do that, to really dive into Indian thought and really immerse myself as much as possible. But I think it's also important to kind of, using the diving metaphor, to come up to the surface and be able, hey, this is what I found. Yeah, I dove deep into the ocean and I pulled up these things from the ground that I found, and here they are. This is what I've recovered, and let me try to explain them to you. So I think that's also an important part of the university, and that we should have people that are kind of have a dexterity in doing that they've cultivated that skill of making connections. I think we call it interdisciplinarity. And we do talk about it, but this is how you do it. You have to do it. You have to start these conversations where you do make these bigger connections. And you're right, absolutely, you're going to fail. Absolutely, you're going to make connections that and produce ideas that somebody else will tear down and they'll bring up something. Well, you said this, but you totally forgot about this point, and this book right here, it completely undermines your thesis. Oh, you're right. Let's go back. But that is also part of what good research is. It does revise itself. So I don't see it as a problem. I mean, a good science is always self-critiquing.
Well, it's been great talking with you, John. I always learn huge amounts from listening to you. You're both incredibly knowledgeable and extremely articulate and good at expressing your ideas. Can I ask you?
Interlocutor, that's all.
Not at all. There must be somebody behind me.
Got Emerson.
Yeah, exactly. You're talking with Emerson. Leonard Cohen is talking with Emerson. I should say that there's a portrait of Leonard Cohen above above John's head, and there's a portrait of Emerson behind me. So you've teed me up perfectly. What is the most important thing that Westerners or Americans should know about India from your research?
Oh boy. I think it's something that we already know.
Hmm.
India is a source of such fertile ideas and richness. I think that India's for yoga, for example.
Hmm.
What a great practice! What a great idea!
Hmm.
Uh, that's we've already kind of assimilated the Bhagavad Gita. It's
Hmm.
become I briefly taught a kind of great books curriculum, and that was no question. Okay, Bhagavad Gita got to be on the list, right? It sounds like you encountered it, maybe in a kind of great books context. I don't know, but I think we already have this sense that India is this fertile ground of ideas. So I think maybe the thing that I would say that we is that there's a lot more to learn, that it's there's so many new areas of Indian thought that are practically unknown, some of which are unknown to Indians themselves, some things which have been lost to Indian civilization itself,
Hmm.
others not. That I guess that's what I would say is we've learned a lot from India. We're indebted to India in so many ways, and there's still a lot more to know.
Well, thank you, John. It's been a tremendous pleasure. I hope we can have you on the podcast again sometime.
I'd love that. This has been great. Really appreciate it. Thanks for setting up. I really appreciate the effort you put into it. It's a great idea. I think that you're really onto something with this idea of like what is the West? This
Mm.
what a great question. Simple but hard at the same time.
Well, if you figure it out, shoot me an email.
I will. I will.
All right. Thanks, John. Bye bye.
Okay.